Hello and welcome to the 9th in this series of training videos on measuring performance in the public sector. My name is Mark Robinson and these videos are brought to you by the European Union. In this session, our focus is going to be on principles for setting good performance targets. In the last session, we discussed performance targets and how they relate to performance indicators. We saw that all targets are based on performance indicators, but when you set a target, you're going beyond merely measuring something. You are setting a specific objective, normally a numerical objective, for that performance indicator. And you are setting it with a clear time horizon in mind to be achieved within a certain period in the future, be it 12 months, 3 months, or longer. Well, in setting performance targets, a number of important issues arise which are going to be the focus of this session. The first concerns the choice of the timeline. When you set a target, is it appropriate that the time horizon for the achievement of that target should be 12 months ahead, or should it be medium term or even longer? Might it sometimes be appropriate to set a much shorter time horizon for the target, say setting a target to be achieved within the next 3 months or 6 months? The second issue is the choice of the numerical value of the target itself. If, for example, you are setting a target for improving the literacy rate of school children over the next 5 years, should your target to be improved literacy by, say, 10%? Is 5% more realistic? Or should you go the whole hog and set a really ambitious target to improve literacy by, say, 25%? The third issue concerns which indicators to use for target setting. Now, as we've seen, all targets are based on performance indicators. But does that mean that all indicators should have targets, or are there possibly reasons why target setting is appropriate for some indicators but not for others? Before we go any further, let's remind ourselves of a little background. Throughout these presentations, we have been drawing a distinction between the indicators which are appropriate for external accountability purposes. In other words, when a ministry or agency is reporting to the public and political leaders about its performance. And on the other hand, indicators which are more relevant to internal management purposes within the ministry or agency. We've emphasized that for external accountability purposes, there are 4 types of performance indicators that are most relevant. These are outcome indicators and 3 types of output indicators, indicators of output quantity, output quality, and output efficiency. By contrast, we've emphasized that for internal management purposes, even though these same indicators are relevant, at the internal management level, activity indicators and input indicators become highly relevant because of the inward focus of internal management. Well, in line with our focus on external accountability, what we're going to focus on in this session is setting targets for outcomes and for outputs. With respect to the time horizons of targets, let's consider a couple of concrete examples. Let's suppose, for example, that the business ministry is setting a target to reduce the amount of time it takes to issue a business license. Now, for that sort of target, setting a target with, say, a 12-month time frame to be achieved by this time next year seems to make good sense. On the other hand, when we consider setting targets for an indicator such as student literacy levels at the end of primary school, then setting a target with a time horizon as short as 12 months seems like a problem. The work of raising literacy levels is work which literally takes years, and under these circumstances it would seem more appropriate to set targets with a medium or longer term time frame. What this highlights is that the time horizon for a performance target should reflect how quickly the government is capable of influencing, of shifting the underlying performance indicator, assuming, of course, the resources are available. There are some things that governments can change relatively quickly, other things that can be changed only slowly. As generalizations, we can say that outcomes generally take time to influence, and therefore most outcome targets should be medium or longer term rather than short term. By contrast, setting annual targets is often an entirely reasonable thing to do for outputs. Setting the right numerical value for a target is extremely important. If targets are set too low, you risk losing most of the motivational benefit of setting the target in the first place. If, on the other hand, targets are set much too high, they risk being demotivating rather than motivating if the ministry or agency concerns believes that there's no way the target can be achieved and there's therefore no point trying to achieve it. Now, there is no general methodology that can be prescribed for choosing the right number for a performance target. It depends very much on the nature of the target concerned. What can, however, be said is that setting the numerical value is a process that should be done carefully, taking into account all of the relevant information. It also needs to be set as a process of dialogue between those, on the one hand, who will be monitoring performance against the target, and on the other hand, those who will be responsible for achieving the target. There needs to be a relationship between the value of the target and the resources that are being made available to the ministry or agency. If funding is being increased, then generally that should mean tougher targets. If, on the other hand, funding is reduced, targets should also be reconsidered. This is something that unfortunately does not always happen. The final very important point is that before you ever set out setting a target, you need to make sure that you have available enough data on what your starting point is. In other words, there needs to be several years of reliable baseline data of the performance indicator concerned, so you know properly where you're starting from in order to set an appropriate and realistic target for where you want to get to. The final major issue concerns the choice of indicators for target setting. Now, there are two basic philosophies here. One philosophy holds that targets should be set for all performance indicators. Perhaps not always annual targets, but that targets, whether annual, medium term or longer term, should be set for every measure which the government reports. The alternative philosophy is quite different. It holds that targets should be set only selectively for certain performance indicators. Let me try to explain the reasoning behind this second philosophy. It reflects two basic propositions. The first is the view that there are some indicators which are important as performance indicators, but over which the government has only very partial control due to the massive influence of external factors, and that given the relatively limited controllability of such indicators, setting targets is not a good idea. They would see indicators such as the rate of growth of GDP and life expectancy of the population as falling into this category for which it's important to have indicators, but where target setting doesn't necessarily make sense. The second point is a very practical one, and it's based on the observation that there is no point setting a target unless that target is going to be monitored and unless there's follow-up. In other words, that for every target you set, someone, whether it's in one of the central agencies or somewhere else in government needs to be keeping an eye on performance against that target. And if the ministry or agency concerned fails to meet the target, there needs to be accountability for that. Now, once you accept that point, there is a problem if government is setting thousands of performance targets. Who is going to monitor and follow up on all of those? So the basic proposition here is that you shouldn't set more targets than you're actually realistically able to monitor and follow up. And reflecting this, those who adopt this selective position point to practice in a number of leading countries over the world that have been highly selective in their target setting and have typically concentrated on setting no more than several hundred outcome and output targets across government. Well, that brings us to the end of this final video in this series on measuring performance in the public sector. In this session, our focus has been on principles for setting good performance targets, with particular reference to the time horizons of performance targets and also the process for setting the numerical value of targets. We've considered whether it's appropriate to set performance targets for all performance indicators or only selectively for some performance indicators. Throughout this entire series of videos, our focus has been on the foundations of public sector performance measurement. We've looked closely at the key concepts of the public sector results chain, outcomes, outputs, activities and inputs, and at the performance indicators associated with them. Measuring performance better in the public sector is crucial to managing performance better and ultimately to performing better.